Hey guys, I'm going to do my mini lecture for the academic writing project, and we're going to talk about integrating and introducing sources. This is something that I'm going to assess fairly closely in your academic writing project, so be sure to watch this closely. Your D2L post will correspond with this as well, so be sure to take good notes because it will be assessed in your D2L post and your academic writing project. But here are a few updates for the rest of the semester. Is that we're not going to do the final project now. It just doesn't seem feasible since we lost a couple weeks to extended spring break. So in essence, the academic writing project is going to become your final project. I'm going to extend the due date by 3 days till the 29th. So that gives you a week from today, which is 4/22/20. So what I will do is I will try to have it graded by the 31st of the month. I think there's 31 days in this month. Anyway, I'll have it graded in 2 days. And then you will get an edited copy with a reader report. And then you will have till the end of the semester to revise, and you will submit that on D2L. So I will grade the drafts fairly closely, but it doesn't mean that that'll have a reflection on the letter grade. But I'm going to make sure that you have a lot to work with for your revision. And then there will also be a brief final 2-page reflective essay where you reflect on what happened in the class this semester. All right, so dogs are barking, sorry. All right, so the dogs were barking, but I think I can get back to it now. I'm going to share my screen, and we will take a look at a PowerPoint, or a Google slide rather, and then I'll just walk through the integrating and introducing sources in academic writing. So let me move this. This might be a little slow because of the way Zoom works. But let me see, I have to pause here for a second. Hold on 1 second. All right, so this is about integrating and introducing sources. So throughout the course of this semester, we've been talking about the street signs of writing. So when you're doing your academic writing project, more or less what you're doing is that you're entering a conversation. So a lot of the things you're saying have probably already been said by somebody else. So you're entering a conversation and you're trying to build on that. Don't see the academic writing project as a sort of report. I don't need you to give me just a report of information. That's why I required you guys to make a thesis statement, because you're making an argument about something, about a conversation that's already happened. So when you're doing this, you have to be able to distinguish between your voice and the voice of people you might be citing and researching. So your readers should always know who is speaking in your paper. You cannot jump from your writing to the writing of others without signifying to the reader you are making that move. So again, think about it as the street signs metaphor. So a few notes on quotes. Your usage of quotes, paraphrase, and summary should be effective. You only implement a quote in your paper when it is needed. Because you're writing this, you're just not presenting a patchwork of quotes from other people, because you want your voice to come through in your writing, not the voice of others. A research paper is a genre of writing where you are offering your own opinion. The sources you integrate should support your own claims. You don't want it to be the other way around. A lot of research does not particularly equate to a solid research paper or a high degree of sophistication. So think that just because you might give me a paper that has 20 sources on it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've done a lot of work. It just means you've done a lot of reading. So think about quality versus quantity in this respect. This lecture is on signal phrases. So according to Hacker and Summers in Rules for Writers, whenever you include a paraphrase, summary, or direct quotation of another writer's work in your paper, prepare your readers for it with introductory words called a signal phrase. A signal phrase usually names the author of the sources and often provides some context for the source material. In the book Rules for Writers, it would be on page 450, but I didn't make you guys buy this book. Let me move my face. Is that these are some signal phrases that you would like to use in MLA or even APA papers. So here are some examples. Michael Pollan, who has written extensively about Americans' unhealthy eating habits, argues that. Another is as a healthy policy experts Mello Studert and Brennan point out. Another is Marion Nessel, New York University professor of nutrition and public health, notes. And then lastly, Conley offers a persuasive counterargument. So you can see here in these model signal phrases that there is a certain usage of verbiage. It usually introduces the author, but then it also is succeeded with a verb. So Michael Pollan argues, health policy experts point out. Marion Nessel notes, Conley offers. So you can see that these verbs signify to your reader the direction you're trying to go. And then you can see a chart here on page 450 for verbs and signal phrases. And I won't go through them all because there's about 50 of them here, but each verb relies on the context of what you're trying to do with that quote. So if someone's trying to make a point about whatever you're talking about, you would use something like Pollan argues, or asserts, or contends, or declares. But if they're refuting something, you might use refutes, or rejects, or denies, or disputes. So you have to use the verb that is right for the context of what you're using that quote. And if we look back to the quote I used from Rules from Writers earlier, I was a bit deliberate in my usage of that because I included a signal phrase. So the quote here appears in quotation marks whenever yada, 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 but I was deliberate in including a signal phrase here. I said, according to Hacker and Summers and Rules for Writers, that's a signal phrase. It's introducing it to your reader. So when you write a signal phrase, choose a verb that is appropriate for the way you are using the source. The chart on page 450, which I will upload to D12, is very helpful. So if you're ever unsure of a signal phrase, just go ahead and look at that chart, or even Google signal phrases. And I think that this helps us work within the culture of street signs that I've tried to establish in the course. Because the signal phrase is indeed a sort of street sign to your reader. Just like you'd be driving down the street and it says turn left in 5 miles, the same thing would apply. Your reader is going through that like it's a road, and then your signal phrase kind of signifies where you're going in your writing. So using signal phrases allows you to move from your words to the words of others, move from your words to the words of a source without feeling a jolt. Because we don't want this shift. You don't want to miss your turn. You want to know it's coming. And so if you think about this driving metaphor, if we're going down the street and then there's no sign, but you know that's your turn, you have to make a quick turn. But if your reader knows it's coming, they don't have to make that jolt or that quick jump. As a writer, you've done that for them. So here is another thing that relates to the signal phrases. A lot of times when I'm grading, I'll say that you guys have included drop quotes or dumped quotes. And essentially all that is that you've used some sort of research or resource in your paper, but you didn't correctly introduce it in your writing. So if we look at this marking boundaries, it would be page 451 from Rules for Writers, and I will put this on D2L as well, is that here's a drop quote. So if we look at these two model paragraphs, it says laws designed to prevent chronic disease by promoting healthier food and beverage consumption also have the potential economic benefits. And then it goes right into the quote, a 1% reduction in the intake of saturated fat, yada, yada, yada. And then they cite it parenthetically. But But if we look here with the quotation with the signal phrase, we have the same topic sentence of the paragraph. Laws designed to prevent chronic disease by promoting healthier food and beverage consumption also have potential economic benefits. Same topic sentence as the drop quote paragraph. But there's a difference. It says Marion Nestle, New York University professor of nutrition and public health, notes that a 1% reduction. So it's just that simple little introductory signal phrase that makes the difference from providing this sort of jolt to your reader to segueing to it much easier and much smoother. And if you're looking for a word count, it's a way to get it to, if you want to be honest. But one thing I would say that when you're doing your signal phrases is that you don't always have to include the credentials of the person you're introducing. You don't have to say Rod Taylor, assistant professor of English, Frederick Douglass Institute scholar at Cal U. You would just say Rod Taylor notes, blah, 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 or whoever else you're quoting. So-and-so argues, so-and-so contends. But you could include the title of the work. So you could say that Bob Smith in Methods for Sleeping Better at Night notes that a 1% reduction, but you don't necessarily have to include their titles and credentials because that might require you to do a little bit more research. You have their name, you have the title of the source text, and then you just include it. And that would apply for studies, journal articles, academic books, interviews, anything like that. Always introduce to your reader what is going on. So we've talked about the signal phrasing, but I'll give you guys some examples. So here you can see very clearly highlighted that Joan Sherman highlights in her comprehensive study of African-American poets that dialect poetry, and then it comes right into the quote. And all it is just that little sentence that signifies to your reader that a quote is coming. Another example. Paul Laurence Dunbar is regaled as the foremost African-American poet of the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Dixon Bruce indicates in black writing from the Nadir. So you see highlighted here, it's the author's name and a verb indicates, and then a source text in black writing from the Nadir that Dunbar wrote poetry in prose and standard English. This is actually a paraphrase or a summary, but it applies for direct quotes, paraphrases, summaries. And then another signal phrase, according to Bruce, and then the quote. So again, according works very well. But just because you use the signal phrase to introduce the quote, that's the easy part. It's good writing. You provide the quote or paraphrase, and then you give the parenthetical citation, but then afterwards you have to provide some sort of analysis or synthesis of the quote. So you've signaling to the reader that you'll be implementing a quote is one rhetorical move that you absolutely must make. However, you cannot leave the quote on an island. Instead, you must use the quote to supplement your own claim. So you're just not throwing that in there to show that you've researched the topic. You're using that to augment your own argument. So because of that, when you include a quote, you have to provide analysis after the fact. So one good metaphor that I found that works in all levels of my teaching is something called the quotation sandwich. So if you think about a sandwich, there are two slices of bread and there's something in the middle. And if you think about that in most circumstances, then doing the signal phrase and the quote and the analysis makes more sense. So always think about it as this tidy sandwich, not a sloppy sandwich. So you have the statement introducing the quotation. That's the signal phrase. And then you have the quotation paraphrase or summary, and then you have an explanation after the parenthetical citation that signifies your analysis or synthesis. So think about it as the first slice of bread is your signal phrase. The meat of the sandwich is the quote, and the bottom slice is your analysis and interpretation of the quote. And I provide a lengthy example here of the quotation sandwich. So you can see here that Paul Laurence Dunbar is regaled as the foremost African-American poet of the late 1800s to early 1900s. Dixon Bruce indicates in black writing from the Nadir that Dunbar wrote poetry in prose and standard English, but is most known for his dialect poetry. However, Dunbar was ambivalent towards this genre. And then we see a signal phrase. According to Bruce, Dunbar recognized that such work was intimately tied to the direction that ideas about racial identity were taking in a segregated society. His dialect work reveals the kind of tensions at an emotional level that such a society could produce. So that's the direct quote that I'm pulling from Bruce's black writing from the Nadir. However, you just can't end. You have to provide some analysis. Bruce hints that many of Dunbar's personal problems stem from the ambivalence he felt writing the genre and not being seen exclusively as a poet's poet, yada, yada, yada. But you can see after the direct quote highlighted in green that the writing highlighted in yellow functions as an analysis and synthesis of Bruce's quote. Another important rule to understand is that if you are writing, you should never end a paragraph in a direct quote. So if this was the last portion, the parenthetical citation on page 60 with the period, you could not simply end a paragraph that way. You always have to end a paragraph with some sort of analysis that transitions what we talked about in earlier lectures, that transitions your reader to the next paragraph. You can't assume your reader is going to do that work for you. You have to do that work for them, because otherwise it's just lazy writing. If you think about academic writing compared to other genres, that it has to be direct, it has to be concise, it has to be clear. Like one thing you don't want to have that might be good for some creative writing, like a poem or a short story, is ambiguity, but that's completely the other way in academic writing. You need to be as clear and concise as possible, because more often than not, people aren't reading academic writing for their leisure like they would a poem or a short story. So you have to get to it. You don't want your reader pondering like, well, what did they mean in this essay? No, you want it to be very clear. And then if they don't agree with it, well, at least they have some foundation to do that based on your research and your writing. So keep that in mind. I'm going to stop the share here for a minute, and then I'm going to take you guys to D2L and show you how I'm going to assess this. I think this is, okay, exit. If we look on D2L in our course module, we have the communication here. This will function as your 9th forum post. So rather than have you do the in-class writing, which I'll be using to assess your participation, I'm going to directly assess this in the discussion forum. So if you go to the weekly discussion forum, I have forum post 9, integrating sources and research. And it simply says, please review the mini lecture on integrating sources. This is the mini lecture. For this post, I need you to employ the quotation sandwich, where you introduce the quote with a signal phrase, include the quote, and then provide analysis or synthesis. If you're unsure about what the analysis or synthesis might be, please shoot me an email and we can talk about it through email, or we can meet up here on Zoom. It might be useful to use a portion of your academic writing project to do this. So if you're working on your academic writing project and you have this pivot point in your essay where you're using a direct quote, you could use it as a chance to revise it and add the signal phrase in the analysis. But after you do that, then you can just plug it in right here as your D2L post. And then I want you to argue why it is important to introduce and analyze your quotes in academic writing. So think about the street signs metaphor. You could simply just regurgitate what I told you in this lecture. Very useful. And if you did watch this lecture, please email me, tell me the timestamp, and I will give you 3 bonus points. So the post should be between 200 and 250 words, but you do not need to respond to any, but you've got to read at least 5. I'm going to leave this where you guys can view it without posting, so you can get an idea what your peers are doing before you do it if you're unsure. But of course, be sure to always email me about this. All right, that concludes our mini lecture on integrating and introducing sources and signal phrases in the quotation sandwich as it pertains to your academic writing project. Email me if you have any questions. Take care. All right, I'm done.